The first rays of sunlight crept slowly across the Columbia River gorge, painting the basalt cliffs in shades of amber and rose. In the frontier town of the Dalles, Oregon Territory, the year was 1878, and the morning air carried the sweet scent of sagebrush mingled with the earthy aroma of the mighty river that had carved this ancient passage through stone. Samuel Morrison stirred in his modest wooden frame house on 3rd Street, the familiar creak of pine floorboards greeting him like an old friend. Once, in another life that seemed as distant as the stars, he had served as a territorial lawman, carrying out the harsh justice of frontier courts. But those days were behind him now, buried like so many memories beneath the endless flow of time. These days, Samuel served the Dalles in a different capacity as the overseer of the town's precious waterworks, the lifeblood that sustained this growing community perched between desert and river. The quilted coverlet, hand-stitched by his late wife Martha years ago, rustled softly as he rose. Each small square of fabric told a story, scraps from her Sunday dress, pieces from their daughter's first pinafore, remnants of the shirt he'd worn on their wedding day. He ran his weathered hands across the intricate patterns, feeling the slight variations in texture, the smooth cotton alternating with rougher homespun wool. Outside his window, the town was beginning its slow awakening. The distant sound of a rooster's crow drifted on the morning breeze, followed by another, then another, as if the birds were passing messages from farm to farm across the hillsides. The air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the promise of another warm autumn day in the high desert country. Samuel's morning routine was as precise and methodical as the flow of water through the wooden flumes he tended. First, he would light the cast iron stove, the sulfur smell of the match giving way to the comforting scent of cedar kindling catching flame. The stove had come all the way around Cape Horn from a foundry in Pennsylvania, its ornate scrollwork a touch of Eastern refinement in this rugged land. As the fire built, he could hear the metal expanding with soft pinging sounds, like distant bells calling the faithful to prayer. Water for washing came from the ceramic pitcher on his washstand, filled the evening before from the kitchen pump. The water was cool against his skin, bracing and clean, drawn from the very aqueduct system he maintained. He lathered his shaving soap with a badger hair brush, the foam releasing the subtle scent of bay rum and lavender. The straight razor, kept sharp on a leather strop, whispered across his cheeks with practiced strokes. His clothing was simple but well-maintained, canvas work pants the color of wheat, a blue chambray shirt soft from countless washings, and sturdy boots that had walked every inch of the water system from source to city. Each piece was donned with deliberate care, buttons fastened one by one, bootlaces drawn tight with a practiced rhythm that had become almost meditative over the years. In the kitchen, breakfast preparations began with the grinding of coffee beans in a hand-cranked mill, the rich, dark aroma filling the small space like incense in a chapel. The beans had come up from San Francisco on the last steamboat, wrapped in burlap that still carried the faint smell of sea salt in distant ports. The coffee pot, blackened from years of use, went onto the stove with fresh water and the ground beans, soon beginning its gentle percolation, a soft, rhythmic bubbling that seemed to match the beating of his heart. While the coffee brewed, Samuel sliced a thick piece of sourdough bread from the loaf he'd purchased from Mrs. Henley's bakery the day before. The crust crackled under his knife, revealing the soft, tangy interior riddled with tiny air pockets. He spread it with butter from the crock in his cool pantry, then added a generous dollop of blackberry preserves that his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had given him in exchange for fixing a leak in her water line. The preserves were perfect, not too sweet, with whole berries that burst on the tongue, releasing memories of summer sunshine. As he ate his simple breakfast, Samuel reviewed his plans for the day. The wooden aqueduct that brought water from the springs in the hills above town required constant maintenance. The Douglas fir flumes, though sturdy, were susceptible to the extremes of weather in this land of hot summers and cold winters. Expansion and contraction, the persistent growth of moss and algae, the occasional damage from falling branches or curious wildlife all required vigilant attention. Through his kitchen window, he could see the town coming to life. Zeb Taylor was already at work in his blacksmith shop, the ring of hammer on anvil creating a steady rhythm that would continue throughout the day. The sound was almost musical, a percussion that had become part of the town's heartbeat. Smoke was rising from the chimney of the Umatilla House, the finest hotel between Portland and Boise, where the Chinese cook, Ah Fong, would already be preparing breakfast for the traveling merchants and land speculators who frequented the establishment. Samuel finished his coffee, savoring the last bittersweet drops, then washed his dishes in the basin, the warm water and lye soap leaving his hands clean and slightly tingling. Everything was returned to its proper place, cup on the shelf, plate in the cupboard, knife in the drawer. Order and routine were not just preferences but necessities in a land where chaos was never more than a storm or a drought away. Stepping out onto his front porch, Samuel paused to breathe deeply of the morning air. The sun had climbed higher now, painting the town in shades of gold and casting long shadows from the false-fronted buildings that lined Main Street. The wooden sidewalks, raised above the dusty streets, would soon echo with the footsteps of merchants opening their shops, housewives beginning their daily shopping, and children reluctantly heading to the schoolhouse. Samuel's first stop each morning was the main distribution point where the aqueduct entered the town proper. The walk took him up Washington Street, past neat houses with picket fences and small gardens where late roses still bloomed, their perfume mixing with the smell of wood smoke from morning fires. Mrs. Patterson was already out tending her chickens, scattering grain with practiced throws while speaking to them in soft, conversational tones. "Morning, Sam," she called out, her weathered face creasing into a smile. "Water running clear today?" "Clear as crystal, Mrs. Patterson," he replied, touching the brim of his felt hat. "Just the way we like it." The path to the waterworks grew steeper as it left the residential area, winding through stands of ponderosa pine and juniper. The trees provided blessed shade, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft, aromatic layer that muffled his footsteps. Occasionally, a gray squirrel would chatter at him from a branch, or a Steller's jay would announce his presence with its harsh call, the flash of blue feathers bright against the dark green canopy. The sound of running water grew louder as he approached the first inspection point. Here, the wooden flume emerged from the hillside, supported on massive trestle works that had been built by crews of Irish and Chinese laborers 5 years earlier. The water flowed steadily, a constant stream about 18 inches deep, clear enough to see the grain of the wood beneath. Samuel walked slowly along the narrow maintenance walkway beside the flume, his experienced eye checking for any signs of damage or wear. The wood was weathering well, the natural oils in the Douglas fir providing protection against rot. He ran his hand along the smooth, water-worn surface, feeling for any splinters or rough spots that might indicate deterioration. At regular intervals, iron bands reinforced the joints where sections of flume met, and he checked each one, ensuring they remained tight and rust-free. At one point, he noticed a small leak where water was seeping between two boards. From his leather tool bag, he extracted a handful of oakum tarred rope fibers that served as caulking. Using a thin metal tool, he carefully pressed the material into the gap. The tar smelled sharp in his nostrils. The leak stopped immediately, the water resuming its intended course. The morning inspection took him along nearly a mile of flume, through varied terrain that showcased the ingenuity of the original engineers. In some places, the aqueduct ran at ground level, following the natural contours of the land. In others, it soared across ravines on trestles that seemed impossibly delicate yet had withstood winter storms and spring floods. At the highest point of his morning rounds, Samuel paused to rest on a weathered boulder that provided a panoramic view of the Dalles spread out below. The Columbia River wound like a great silver snake through the landscape, its surface dotted with the white sails of fishing boats and the occasional black smoke of a steam-powered vessel. The town itself looked peaceful and prosperous, with new buildings rising on the outskirts and established businesses thriving in the center. He pulled out his pocket watch, a silver timepiece that had belonged to his father, and noted the time 8:30. The watch ticked steadily, its mechanical precision a comfort in this world of natural rhythms and cycles. Time to continue his rounds. The path down from the aqueduct brought Samuel through a different part of town, past the new Methodist church with its white clapboard walls and modest steeple. Reverend Thompson was outside, sweeping the steps with slow, meditative strokes, preparing for the midweek prayer meeting. "Samuel," the Reverend called out, his voice carrying the gentle authority of his calling. "How fares our water supply?" "Flowing steady as your faith, Reverend," Samuel replied, which earned him a warm chuckle. "The Lord provides, but He expects us to maintain what He's given us," the Reverend said, leaning on his broom. "Your work is a ministry of its own, bringing life-giving water to our community." Samuel had never thought of it quite that way, but there was truth in the Reverend's words. Water was indeed life in this dry country, and his role in maintaining its flow was perhaps a form of service as important as any other. Continuing on, he passed the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Eleanor Bradshaw was teaching the town's children. Through the open windows, he could hear her clear voice reciting multiplication tables, the children's voices joining in with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. 7 times 7 is 49, 7 times 8 is 56, 7 times 9 is 63. The Chinese section of town was his next destination, where several families relied on a secondary line from the aqueduct for their laundries and vegetable gardens. The air here was different, scented with unfamiliar spices and the steam from the wash houses. Mr. Liu, who ran the largest laundry, was already at work, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he sorted garments. "Mr. Samuel," Liu called out in his accented but precise English. "Water pressure very good today." "Very good for washing." Samuel checked the distribution valve that controlled flow to this section, adjusting it slightly to ensure even pressure throughout the system. The Chinese community had been instrumental in building the railroad that brought prosperity to the Dalles, and Samuel made sure their water needs were met with the same diligence as anyone else's in town. The morning was warming now, the sun climbing toward its zenith. Samuel could feel perspiration beginning to form beneath his shirt, the fabric clinging slightly to his back. He stopped at a public fountain, one of 3 he'd insisted on installing throughout town, and cupped his hands to drink. The water was cool and sweet, with just a hint of the minerals it picked up on its journey from the mountain springs. His rounds took him past the grain mill, where the water wheel turned steadily, its massive wooden paddles groaning softly as they converted the water's flow into mechanical power. Inside, he could hear the rumble of millstones grinding wheat into flour, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet. The miller, Hans Müller, waved from the doorway, his clothing dusted white with flour, looking like a figure emerged from a winter storm. As the sun reached its highest point, Samuel made his way to his small office in the town's municipal building. The office was sparse but functional, a wooden desk scarred from years of use, a filing cabinet containing maps and maintenance records, and a shelf of technical books on hydraulic engineering that he'd accumulated over the years. He spent an hour updating his logs, recording the morning's observations in his careful, precise handwriting. Water flow rates, pressure readings, maintenance performed, materials used, all meticulously documented. These records would be invaluable for whoever succeeded him in this position, a written history of the town's water system. Lunch was taken at the Cosmopolitan Restaurant, a modest establishment run by the widow Martinez. The dining room was filled with the usual mix of townspeople, merchants taking a break from their shops, travelers passing through, laborers fortifying themselves for the afternoon's work. The air was thick with conversation and the mingling aromas of beef stew, fresh bread, and coffee. Samuel sat at his usual table by the window, where he could watch the street life while he ate. Mrs. Martinez brought him a bowl of her famous chili con carne without being asked, knowing his preferences after years of regular patronage. "Not too spicy today, Mr. Sam," she said with a wink. "I save the hot peppers for the young cowboys who think they're tough." The chili was perfect, rich and warming, with tender chunks of beef and beans in a sauce that had been simmering since dawn. He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, accompanied by cornbread that crumbled perfectly, releasing little puffs of steam. At the next table, two land speculators were discussing the possibility of bringing the railroad directly through the Dalles, their voices animated with the fever of potential profit. Samuel listened with half an ear, knowing that such development would mean increased demand on the water system, more growth, more change. Progress was inevitable, but part of him treasured the town as it was now large enough to be civilized, small enough that everyone knew their neighbors. After lunch, he walked to the general store to purchase supplies for the week ahead. Morrison's Mercantile, no relation, despite the shared surname, was the largest store in town, its shelves stocked with everything from nails to fancy hats from San Francisco. The interior was dim and cool, with that particular smell that all general stores seem to share, a mixture of leather, coffee, tobacco, and pickle brine from the barrel by the counter. Mr. Morrison, James, to distinguish him from Samuel, was helping a homesteader's wife select fabric, holding up bolts of calico and gingham to catch the light from the window. Samuel wandered the aisles, collecting the items he needed: lamp oil, matches, a new whetstone for his pocket knife, and a pound of penny nails for emergency repairs to the flumes. "Find everything you need, Sam?" James Morrison asked as he tallied up the purchases on a piece of brown paper with a stubby pencil. "Always do in your store, James," Samuel replied, watching as the items were wrapped in paper and tied with string. The afternoon brought different responsibilities. Samuel met with Thomas Chen, one of his maintenance assistants, at the secondary reservoir on the east side of town. Thomas was a second-generation Chinese-American, his father having come to America to build the Central Pacific Railroad. He had a natural understanding of water flow and had proven invaluable in maintaining the more complex parts of the system. Together, they cleaned the settling tanks where sediment was removed from the water before distribution. It was messy work, shoveling out the accumulated silt and organic matter, but necessary to keep the water clean and clear. They worked in companionable silence mostly, the only sounds the scrape of shovels and the constant gurgle of incoming water. "My father used to tell me," Thomas said during a break, wiping sweat from his brow, "that in China, the man who controls the water controls the empire. Here, we just try to keep it flowing where it needs to go." "Wisdom in both views," Samuel replied, leaning on his shovel. "Water doesn't care about empires or towns. It just follows its nature, and we try to guide it." The afternoon sun beat down on them as they worked, but there was satisfaction in the physical labor, in seeing the tanks clean and ready for another month of service. When they finished, both men were tired and dirty, but the job was done properly. Samuel's next stop was the town's fire station, where the volunteer fire brigade kept their equipment. The hand-pumped fire engine, pride of the Dalles, required a constant supply of water to be effective. Samuel checked the special high-pressure connection that fed the fire reservoir, ensuring it was clear and functional. Fire was an ever-present danger in a town built primarily of wood, and the water system was the first line of defense. Chief Sullivan, a massive Irishman with arms like tree trunks from years of working the pumps, was drilling his volunteers in the yard. "Afternoon, Sam," he called out. "How's our water supply looking?" "Ready whenever you need it, Chief," Samuel assured him. "Lord willing, that won't be any time soon." "Amen to that," Sullivan agreed, then turned back to his men. "All right, lads, let's run through it again. Every second counts when flames are licking at the rafters." As the afternoon wore on, Samuel made his way to the newer part of town, where expansion was creating demands on the water system. New houses were being built, each wanting their own connection to the aqueduct. He met with several property owners, explaining what would be required to extend service to their lots, making notes and sketches in his field notebook. One of the new arrivals, a young couple from Ohio, had purchased a lot on the hillside with a spectacular view of the river. The husband, Mr. Garrett, was eager to begin construction but concerned about water access. "We've been told the water pressure might not be sufficient at this elevation," he said, worry creasing his young face. Samuel studied the lay of the land, calculating distances and elevations in his head. "We can make it work," he said finally. "Might need a small pumping station, wind-powered most likely. The breeze up here is steady enough to keep a windmill turning." The relief on the young couple's faces was evident. "We're much obliged, Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Garrett said. "We've come so far to make a new life here. It's good to know there are folks willing to help." As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Samuel made his final inspection of the day. This took him to the original source of the aqueduct, high in the hills above town. The walk was longer and steeper, but he enjoyed the solitude and the changing light on the landscape. The path wound through groves of oak and madrona, their twisted trunks creating fantastic shapes in the gathering dusk. The madrona bark was particularly beautiful at this time of day, its smooth, reddish surface glowing like copper in the slanted light. Somewhere in the distance, A mourning dove called, its melancholic song perfectly suited to the evening hour. The spring itself was a marvel, a natural artesian well that bubbled up from deep within the earth, fed by underground rivers whose sources were lost in the geological mysteries of the Cascade Range. The water emerged at a constant temperature, cool in summer, relatively warm in winter, never freezing even in the coldest weather. Samuel sat on a familiar rock beside the spring, listening to the water's eternal song. This was his favorite time of day, when the responsibilities of his position fell away and he could simply exist in the moment, watching the water begin its journey to the town below. The spring was surrounded by moss and ferns, creating a small oasis of green in the otherwise dry landscape. He pulled out his tobacco pouch and pipe, an evening ritual he allowed himself. The tobacco was a Virginia blend, mild and sweet, and he packed it carefully into the bowl, tamping it down with practiced movements. The first match didn't take, rarely did in the evening breeze, but the second caught, and soon he was drawing smooth, contemplative puffs, the smoke mixing with the mist from the spring. As he sat there, memories drifted through his mind like the smoke from his pipe. Martha would have loved this spot, would have brought her watercolors to try to capture the play of light on water. Their daughter, now grown and living in Portland with her husband, had played in these very pools as a child, her laughter echoing off the rocks. The life he'd led before, the grim duties he'd performed in the name of frontier justice, seemed to belong to another man entirely. He'd found redemption of sorts in this work, bringing life rather than death, sustaining rather than ending. The water didn't judge, it simply flowed, constant and necessary. A deer emerged from the woods, a doe with liquid eyes, coming to drink at the spring. She saw Samuel but sensed no threat from the still figure wreathed in pipe smoke. She drank delicately, her pink tongue barely disturbing the water's surface, then melted back into the forest as silently as she'd come. The walk back to town in the gathering darkness was peaceful, his feet finding the familiar path without conscious thought. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, Venus bright in the west, the constellation of Orion rising in the east. The air was cooling rapidly, as it did in the high desert, and he pulled his jacket closer around him. The town looked different at night, windows glowing with lamplight, creating warm squares of yellow in the darkness. He could hear pianos from the saloons on Front Street, the music drifting on the evening air, sometimes a melancholy ballad, sometimes a lively dance tune. The respectable folks were heading home while the night crowd was just beginning to emerge. Samuel stopped at the bakery, which was closed for the evening, but Mrs. Henley had left a loaf of fresh bread on the back step as she often did, knowing his schedule. He left payment in the small box provided for that purpose, a system based entirely on trust that seemed to work perfectly well. His own house was dark and quiet when he arrived, but it took only moments to light the lamps, their warm glow pushing back the shadows. He built up the fire in the stove, not for warmth so much as for the comfort of its presence, the crackling of wood and the occasional pop of resin, a familiar symphony. Dinner was simple, the fresh bread with slices of cheese and dried beef, an apple from the barrel in his pantry, and a pot of tea made from herbs his neighbor Mrs. Chin had given him. She claimed the mixture aided digestion and promoted restful sleep, and whether through actual properties or simply the power of suggestion, it did seem to help. He ate at his kitchen table, reading from a week-old copy of the Oregonian that had come upriver on the last steamboat. The news from the outside world seemed distant and somewhat unreal, political scandals in Washington, New inventions being demonstrated in New York, social changes sweeping through the cities of the East. Here in the Dalles, life moved at a different pace, governed more by seasons than by headlines. After dinner, he performed his evening maintenance on his tools, oiling the metal parts to prevent rust, checking his supply of repair materials, making notes of what needed to be ordered from Portland. These simple, repetitive tasks were soothing, requiring just enough attention to quiet the mind without taxing it. 3 days into what had been an ordinary week, Samuel was awakened before dawn by urgent pounding on his door. He rose quickly, pulling on his pants and boots, already knowing that only an emergency would bring someone to his door at this hour. Thomason stood on his porch, lantern in hand, his usually calm face etched with concern. "Mr. Morrison, we have a problem at the main aqueduct. The support trestle at Devil's Canyon is showing signs of failure." Devil's Canyon was a deep ravine about 2 miles above town, where the aqueduct crossed on one of its highest trestles. A failure there would not only cut off the town's water supply but could send thousands of gallons of water rushing down the canyon in a destructive flood. Samuel grabbed his emergency kit, tools, rope, materials for temporary repairs, and followed Thomas into the pre-dawn darkness. They half walked, half ran up the maintenance path, their lanterns casting wild shadows on the trees. The air was cold, their breath forming clouds of vapor that glowed in the lantern light. As they climbed higher, Samuel could hear it, a groaning, creaking sound that made his blood run cold. Wood under extreme stress, preparing to give way. They rounded the final bend and saw the problem immediately. The main support beam on the trestle, a massive Douglas fir timber that had seemed immortal, had developed a significant crack. The weight of the water-filled flume was causing it to bow visibly. "How long has it been like this?" Samuel asked, already assessing the situation. "I noticed it on my evening rounds," Thomas replied. "It's gotten worse in just the last few hours." Samuel's mind raced through possibilities. They needed to reduce the weight on the trestle immediately, but simply shutting off the water would leave the town without supply and could cause pressure problems throughout the system. They needed a controlled solution. "Thomas, run back to town. Wake Chief Sullivan and his strongest men. We need ropes, block and tackles, and every piece of strong timber they can find. Also alert Mayor Hoffman, we may need to ration water for a few days." Thomas nodded and disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps fading quickly. Samuel remained, watching the damaged beam, calculating how much time they had. With each groan of the wood, his concern grew. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east when the rescue party arrived. Chief Sullivan had brought a dozen men, all carrying equipment. Mayor Hoffman was there too, despite his 60 years, ready to help however he could. "What's the plan, Sam?" Sullivan asked, assessing the situation with his firefighter's eye for structural dangers. Samuel had been formulating a strategy. "We need to build a temporary support structure while we replace the damaged beam. But first, we need to reduce the water flow to decrease the weight." He directed the men with calm authority, born not from his dark past but from years of understanding how water and wood and stone work together. They installed a series of bypass channels, using canvas and smaller wooden troughs to redirect some of the water flow around the damaged section. The work was dangerous, requiring men to climb out onto the trestle while it groaned and swayed slightly. Every creak of wood caused hearts to race, but they continued, driven by necessity and trust in Samuel's expertise. Word of the crisis spread through the Dalles like wildfire. By full daylight, dozens of townspeople had gathered at the base of the canyon, ready to help. Women brought food and coffee for the workers. Children were sent to gather specific materials. Even the often isolated Chinese community joined the effort, their experience with railroad construction proving invaluable. Mr. Liu arrived with a team of his countrymen, carrying massive timbers they had been saving for a new building. "Water for town more important than new laundry," he said simply. The work continued throughout the day, the damaged beam carefully supported while a replacement was prepared. It was a marvel of frontier engineering, using techniques borrowed from railroad trestles, mining operations, and even shipbuilding. Samuel worked alongside the others, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool autumn air. His hands, already calloused from daily work, developed new blisters that he ignored. There was something profound about the communal effort, people who might normally pass each other with just a nod now working shoulder to shoulder for a common cause. Reverend Thompson arrived with members of his congregation, not to preach but to work. "Many hands make light work," he said, taking up a hammer. "And this is the Lord's work as surely as any sermon." Even the saloon girls from Front Street appeared, bringing baskets of sandwiches and cool drinks. One of them, a woman named Rose whom polite society usually pretended didn't exist, worked the water pump tirelessly, keeping the workers supplied with fresh water. As the sun reached its zenith, the most critical phase began. The damaged beam had to be removed while the temporary supports held the weight. Every person held their breath as the massive timber was slowly extracted, inch by inch. The temporary structure groaned but held, and a collective sigh of relief went up from the crowd. Just as the replacement beam was being moved into position, disaster struck. Whether from metal fatigue, wood rot, or simply the accumulation of stress, one of the temporary supports suddenly splintered with a sound like a gunshot. The entire structure lurched, and for a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the whole aqueduct would come crashing down. "Everyone back!" Samuel shouted, but even as he said it, he was moving forward, not back. The flume was tilting, water beginning to cascade over the side. If it fell completely, the rush of water would not only destroy months of work but could wash away homes in the canyon below. Without thinking, Samuel grabbed one of the guide ropes attached to the replacement beam. Others followed his lead: Sullivan, Thomas, even Mayor Hoffman. They pulled with every ounce of strength, trying to guide the massive timber into place before everything collapsed. The wood groaned and cracked. Water poured down, soaking everyone, making the ground muddy and treacherous. Samuel's boots slipped, and he went to one knee, but he didn't let go of the rope. His hands were raw, the rope burning through his work gloves, but he pulled harder. "On 3!" Sullivan shouted. 1, 2, 3. With a collective heave that seemed to come from the very soul of the community, they managed to slide the replacement beam into position. Thomas and several others scrambled to secure it with iron bolts, their hammers ringing like church bells. For several long minutes, the structure swayed and groaned, finding its new equilibrium. Then, gradually, it settled. The flow of water resumed its proper course, and the immediate danger passed. A cheer went up from the crowd, but Samuel barely heard it. He was sitting on the ground, exhausted, his hands bloody from the rope burns, but satisfied. They had done it. The town's water supply was saved. As the sun began to set, the crowd gradually dispersed, everyone exhausted but exhilarated by their shared accomplishment. Samuel remained at the site with Thomas and a few others, making final adjustments and ensuring everything was secure for the night. Mrs. Martinez appeared with a pot of her chili and fresh cornbread. "Heroes need to eat," she said simply, ladling out generous portions. They ate sitting on rocks and logs, watching the water flow smoothly through the repaired section. The crisis had passed, but Samuel knew there would be days of additional work to fully reinforce the structure. "You did a brave thing today," Thomas said quietly. "When everyone else stepped back, you stepped forward." Samuel shook his head. "We all did what was needed. That's what community means." As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, creating pools of warm light in the gathering gloom. Someone had brought a guitar, and soon soft music drifted through the canyon, mixing with the sound of flowing water. It was a moment of perfect peace after the day's chaos. One by one, people drifted away, back to their homes and regular lives. Samuel was among the last to leave, making one final inspection by lantern light. The repair was solid, the water flowing clear and steady. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, all was well. The walk back to town was slow and painful, his exhausted muscles protesting every step. But there was also a deep satisfaction, a feeling of purpose fulfilled. He had found redemption in this work, transformation from an agent of ending to a guardian of life-giving water. Back in his house, Samuel heated water for a bath, a luxury he rarely indulged in but desperately needed tonight. The galvanized tub was filled with steaming water into which he added Epsom salts that Mrs. Chen had recommended for sore muscles. Lowering himself into the water was both agony and ecstasy. His blistered hands stung, his muscles ached, but the warmth was incredibly soothing. He lay back, letting the heat penetrate deep into his bones, washing away not just the dirt and sweat of the day but also the tension and fear. Through the window, he could see stars appearing in the clear desert sky. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, reminding him of the water flowing through the aqueduct, both following paths laid down by forces greater than human understanding. After his bath, he dressed in his nightshirt and sat by the fire with a cup of Mrs. Chen's herbal tea. His hands were wrapped in clean bandages, the white cloth a reminder of the day's labors. He thought about writing to his daughter, telling her about the day's events, but his hands hurt too much to hold a pen. Tomorrow would be soon enough. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, he could hear the normal sounds of the town settling for the night, dogs barking, doors closing, the distant piano from one of the saloons. But underneath it all, if he listened carefully, he could hear the water flowing through the town's fountains and taps, a constant whisper of life. He picked up his Bible, not from religious fervor but from habit and comfort. The familiar words were soothing, especially the Psalms with their imagery of water and restoration. "He leads me beside still waters, he restores my soul." The words took on new meaning after the day's events. That night, Samuel's dreams were filled with water, not nightmares of flooding and collapse, but peaceful visions of rivers and springs, of rain falling on thirsty ground, of water bringing life to the desert. In his dreams, Martha was there, young and laughing, standing by the spring in the hills, her hands cupped to catch the crystal clear water. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, but moved more slowly than usual, his body reminding him of yesterday's exertions. His hands throbbed as he unwrapped the bandages to check the damage. The blisters were raw but clean, already beginning to heal. Breakfast was simple, as he could barely grip his coffee cup. But the coffee was good, strong and bitter, exactly what he needed. Through his window, he could see Thomaschen already heading up the path to check on the repairs, his lantern bobbing in the pre-dawn darkness. Samuel dressed carefully, his stiff fingers struggling with buttons. He would need to take things easier today, supervise rather than do the heavy work himself. But that was all right. Yesterday had proven that the community could come together when needed, that his years of maintaining the system had created not just infrastructure but also understanding and respect. Outside, the morning was crisp and clear, with a touch of frost on the grass. His breath formed clouds in the cold air as he walked slowly toward the municipal building. Several people called out greetings, their voices warm with the shared memory of yesterday's crisis and triumph. At his office, he found a basket on his doorstep, fresh bread from Mrs. Henley, a jar of salve from Mrs. Chen, and a note from Mayor Hoffman thanking him for his leadership. These simple gestures of gratitude meant more than any formal recognition could have. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, but it was controlled, purposeful work rather than crisis management. The temporary repairs were reinforced and made permanent. Additional inspections revealed other areas that needed attention, and Samuel organized work crews to address each issue methodically. The town council met and, at Mayor Hoffman's urging, approved funds for a complete overhaul of the aging aqueduct system. It would be a massive undertaking, requiring months of work, but the near disaster had shown everyone the importance of the water supply. Samuel spent his days now more as a teacher and supervisor than a laborer. His injured hands were healing but still tender, and he found unexpected pleasure in passing on his knowledge to younger workers. Thomaschen proved an especially apt pupil, absorbing not just the technical aspects but also the philosophy of water management. Water always finds its level, Samuel told him one afternoon as they surveyed a section of flume. You can guide it, channel it, store it, but you can't force it to be what it's not. Same with people, I've found. The autumn days grew shorter and cooler. The leaves on the oaks turned golden, then brown, carpeting the ground with a rustling layer that crunched underfoot. The water in the aqueduct ran colder now, and ice would form on the edges during the coldest nights, though the flow never stopped. Samuel developed new routines to accommodate his healing hands and the increased workforce. He would rise at the same time, perform his morning ablutions with the same care, but now his rounds included checking on the various work crews, offering advice, and solving problems that arose. The Chinese workers taught him some of their techniques for working with wood and water, methods developed over centuries in their homeland. In return, he ensured they were treated fairly, paid the same wages as other workers despite the grumbling from some quarters. Water doesn't care about the color of the hands that guide it, he said firmly at a town meeting when the issue was raised. Neither should we. As October gave way to November, the first snows dusted the hills above the Dalles. The water from the spring ran clearer and colder, and ice became a daily concern on the wooden flumes. Samuel organized crews to spread sawdust on the walkways and installed canvas covers over the most exposed sections. The work on the aqueduct continued despite the weather. They were racing against winter now, trying to complete the most critical repairs before heavy snow made the upper reaches impassable. Samuel pushed himself hard, his hands now healed but bearing new scars from that day of crisis. In the evenings, he would often find himself at the Umatilla house, not for the drink but for the company. The hotel's parlor was a gathering place for the town's leading citizens, and Samuel, once a solitary figure, now found himself welcomed into their conversations. Judge Whitman, who had arrived in the Dalles the previous year, often sought his opinion on matters of town planning. "Water rights will be the big issue as we grow," the judge said one evening, pipe smoke wreathing his head. "We need clear policies, fair distribution." Samuel nodded, having thought about this often. "The water belongs to everyone and no one," he said. "Our job is just to make sure it gets where it's needed." These evening discussions would range over many topics: the coming of the railroad, the growth of wheat farming in the region, the tensions between old settlers and new arrivals. But always, somehow, they came back to water, the essential element that made everything else possible. One evening, as November rain pelted the windows, Dr. Harrington mentioned something that gave Samuel pause. "I've been reading about these new filtration systems they're using in the big eastern cities. Sand and gravel beds that remove impurities. Might be something to consider for the Dalles." Samuel made a mental note to write to Portland for more information. The spring water was naturally pure, but as the town grew, contamination became more of a risk. It was the kind of forward thinking that his younger self would never have considered, but now seemed essential. As winter truly set in, life in the Dalles settled into its cold weather rhythm. The saloons did brisker business as men sought warmth and company. The churches were fuller too, people drawing together against the isolation that winter could bring. Samuel's daily routines adapted to the season. He wore a heavy wool coat now, and fur-lined gloves that Mrs. Patterson had made for him from rabbit pelts. His morning coffee was supplemented with a shot of whiskey, purely for medicinal purposes, to ward off the chill. The aqueduct required different maintenance in winter. Ice dams could form, blocking flow and causing overflows. Samuel and his crews would break these up with long poles, the ice shattering like glass and flowing away in chunks that sparkled in the weak winter sun. On particularly cold nights, he would stay up late, checking the most vulnerable sections of the system by lantern light. The world was different at night in winter. Sounds carried further in the cold air, and the snow muffled footsteps until walking became almost silent. One such night, he encountered a family of deer drinking from an overflow pool near the aqueduct. They stood frozen in his lantern light, their eyes reflecting like stars, their breaths steaming in the frigid air. For a long moment, man and beasts regarded each other, then the deer bounded away, their white tails flashing in the darkness. These solitary patrols gave him time to think, to reflect on the strange path his life had taken. From enforcer of final justice to guardian of life-giving water, it was a transformation he could never have imagined in his younger days. Yet it felt right, as if this had always been his true calling, waiting for him to discover it. The work on the aqueduct improvements continued even in the cold, though at a slower pace. The men worked in shifts now, warming themselves by fires built in metal drums, their hands stiff with cold despite heavy gloves. Samuel made sure hot coffee was always available, and Mrs. Martinez sent up pots of soup that steamed in the winter air. As December arrived, the Dalles began preparing for Christmas. Store windows displayed toys and treats, and the smell of baking filled the air as housewives prepared traditional cookies and cakes. Even the Chinese community, though not Christian, participated in the general spirit of celebration and gift-giving. Samuel found himself unexpectedly busy with a special project. The town council had decided to create a public skating rink, using water from the aqueduct to flood a low-lying area near the school. It was Samuel's job to engineer the flooding and ensure the ice would be smooth and safe. He worked with Thomas Chen to design a system of shallow channels that would distribute the water evenly. On the chosen night, with the temperature well below freezing, they opened the valves and watched as water spread across the prepared ground, gleaming in the moonlight like quicksilver. By morning, the rink was frozen solid, and children were already testing it, their delighted shouts echoing across town. Samuel stood watching, a rare smile on his weathered face, as youngsters who had never seen ice skating tried to imitate the moves of those who had come from colder climates. Miss Bradshaw, the schoolteacher, glided past with surprising grace. "Mr. Morrison," she called out. "You must try it." He shook his head, but she persisted, and somehow he found himself sitting on a bench while she helped him strap on a pair of borrowed skates. His first steps onto the ice were tentative, his arms windmilling for balance, but gradually he found a rhythm, sliding more than skating, but moving nonetheless. The children laughed, not mockingly but with delight at seeing the serious water-keeper attempting something so frivolous. One little girl, the banker's daughter, took his hand and tried to show him how to glide properly. Her small hand in his scarred one was trust incarnate. That evening, exhausted and somewhat bruised from several falls, Samuel sat by his fire with an unusual feeling of contentment. He had participated in pure joy today, something he hadn't done since Martha's death. It was a small step, but significant. Winter solstice came with a blizzard that shut down the Dalles for 3 days. The snow fell so thick and fast that visibility was reduced to mere feet. Samuel worried about the aqueduct, knowing that heavy snow could collapse the covered sections if it accumulated too much. When the storm finally passed, he and his crews worked tirelessly to clear the snow from the flumes. It was back-breaking work, shoveling the heavy, wet snow while balanced on narrow walkways slippery with ice. But it had to be done, the town's water supply depended on it. During this time, he noticed something that warmed his heart more than any fire could. Without being asked, townspeople appeared to help. Not just the usual volunteers, but people who had never before shown interest in the waterworks. The shared crisis of yesterday had created a sense of communal responsibility. Even old Mr. Garrett, the banker who rarely lifted anything heavier than a pen, showed up with a shovel. "Can't have the town going dry," he said gruffly, attacking a snowdrift with surprising vigor. By Christmas Eve, the aqueduct was clear and flowing freely. Samuel attended the evening service at the Methodist church, not from religious conviction but from a sense of community. The church was packed, warm with body heat and decorated with pine boughs that filled the air with their resinous scent. Reverend Thompson's sermon was about water, of all things, the living water that Christ offered, the waters of baptism, the water turned to wine. He even mentioned the town's aqueduct, comparing it to the spiritual channels that brought grace to human souls. "We have among us," the Reverend said, "a man who understands the importance of maintaining the channels through which blessings flow. Samuel Morrison keeps our physical water flowing, reminding us to tend to our spiritual wells with equal diligence. Samuel shifted uncomfortably at being singled out, but the congregation's warm murmurs of agreement made him realize he had become, without intending it, a respected member of the community. After the service, people pressed small gifts into his hands: a knitted scarf, a jar of preserves, a carved wooden pipe. He walked home through the snow-muffled streets, his arms full of these tokens of appreciation, feeling a connection to the Dalles that went beyond mere residence. The new year of 1879 arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Samuel stood at his usual spot by the spring as the sun rose on January 1st, watching the water bubble up from the earth, steaming in the frigid air. Another year of guardianship lay ahead, another year of maintaining the flow that sustained the Dalles. He had received a letter from his daughter, arriving on the last steamboat before the river froze. She was with child, would make him a grandfather by summer. The thought was both thrilling and melancholic, reminding him of the passage of time, of Martha's absence from these milestone moments. The winter days passed in a steady rhythm. Morning inspections, afternoon repairs, evening record-keeping. The work was harder in winter, but there was a satisfaction in keeping the water flowing despite nature's challenges. Every icicle that formed and was cleared, every frozen valve that was thawed, was a small victory against entropy. Thomas Chin was proving himself capable of taking on more responsibility. Samuel began teaching him not just the practical aspects of the job but also the administrative side, the record-keeping, the planning, the diplomacy required to balance competing water needs. "You're preparing me to take over," Thomas said one day, not a question but a statement. Samuel nodded. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. The water will keep flowing long after we're both gone. Our job is to make sure someone knows how to tend it." It was a sobering thought but also a comforting one. The work would continue, the water would flow, the town would thrive. His role in that continuity was small but essential, like a single board in the great flume that carried the water from mountain to town. As February gave way to March, signs of spring began to appear. The ice on the flumes melted during the day, though it still formed at night. Birds began returning from their winter grounds, their songs adding music to the morning inspections. The spring runoff would begin soon, and Samuel was preparing for it. High water could be as dangerous as drought, overwhelming the aqueduct's capacity and causing washouts. He organized crews to reinforce vulnerable sections and clear debris from overflow channels. One morning, as he walked the upper sections of the aqueduct, he discovered a place where beavers had built a dam, diverting some of the flow. It was a marvel of engineering, using branches, mud, and stones to create a structure that would have made any human engineer proud. Rather than destroy it immediately, Samuel studied it, learning from the beavers' techniques. They had identified a weak point in the system that he hadn't noticed, a place where water wanted to escape. He made notes to reinforce that section, then carefully dismantled the beaver dam, leaving materials nearby so the industrious animals could build elsewhere, away from the aqueduct. The days grew longer and warmer. The town began to stir from its winter lethargy, with new construction projects beginning and farmers preparing their fields for planting. The demand for water would increase dramatically soon, and Samuel was ready for it. One evening, as he sat on his porch enjoying the mild weather, Mrs. Chin approached with a pot of tea and some unfamiliar pastries. "Spring festival food," she explained. for new beginnings and continued flow. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the hills, the sky painted in shades of rose and gold. The air was filled with the sound of flowing water from the town's fountains, a liquid music that had become the soundtrack to Samuel's life. As our story of this day in Samuel Morrison's life draws to a close, we find him preparing for bed on a typical spring evening. The events of the aqueduct crisis have become part of the Dalles folklore, but life has returned to its normal rhythms. He performs his evening ablutions with the same care as always, the water from his basin cool against his weathered skin. His reflection in the mirror shows a man changed by his years of service, grayer, more lined, but with eyes that hold peace rather than the haunted look they once carried. In his bedroom, he opens the window slightly, letting in the night air with its hints of blooming flowers and distant rain. The sound of the water flowing through the town's fountains drifts in, a constant whisper that has become as necessary to him as breathing. He settles into bed, the familiar creak of the rope springs beneath the mattress a comforting sound. The quilt made by Martha covers him, its weight and warmth a tangible connection to love and memory. On the bedside table, his watch ticks steadily, marking time's passage with mechanical precision. As sleep approaches, his mind drifts over the day's events, the morning inspection, the conversations with townspeople, the small repairs and adjustments that keep the water flowing. Tomorrow will bring similar tasks, similar rhythms, similar satisfactions. But tonight, there is only peace. The water flows through its wooden channels, following paths laid down by human hands but obeying older laws of gravity and pressure. It brings life to the Dalles, just as it has brought redemption to Samuel Morrison, washing away the stains of the past in its endless, purifying flow. His breathing deepens and slows, matching the rhythm of the water's whisper. In his dreams, he walks beside an endless aqueduct, checking for leaks, maintaining the flow, ensuring that the water reaches everyone who needs it. It is good work, necessary work, healing work. And in the morning, when the first light touches the Columbia River gorge, he will rise and do it all again, another day in the life of the water keeper of the Dalles, guardian of the flow that sustains life in this dry land. The water sings its ancient song, and Samuel Morrison sleeps, content in his purpose, at peace with his place in the great flow of existence. The aqueduct stands strong against the hillside, a testament to human ingenuity and community spirit, carrying its precious burden from mountain spring to frontier town, as constant as the stars, as necessary as breath. In the Dalles, the water flows, and all is well.